Go ahead.
All right. So I'm gonna see if I can hide that poll there. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership we have going on here in northeastern Wisconsin. It's been labeled the Northeast Wisconsin Forestry and Wildlife Partnership. There we go. So just a little bit about me before we start talking about that. I have a background in production agriculture. I grew up in South Dakota, transitioned to bee farming in Wisconsin. My bachelor's education is from UW Wisconsin Stevens Point in wildlife ecology and management. I worked for the Aldo Leopold Foundation for a little bit down there in Baraboo. Then I left to Oklahoma, got a master's in forest ecology and management. And I came back up to Wisconsin, working for the Rough Grouse Society as a forest wildlife specialist. So I was partner staff along with NRCS for 2 or 3 years. And then I joined NRCS full time as a resource conservationist out of our Lena field office, which is in northeastern Wisconsin, about half an hour north of Green Bay or halfway between Green Bay and Crivets. Something along those lines. And then when we spun up this Joint Chiefs partnership and were selected for funding at that level, I've been doing some coordinator things on that line, which includes doing webinars. So I'm not very good at webinars like this. So I think this is the first one I've ever done. So if I'm confusing you or something like that, feel free to ask questions whenever, and I'll try to clear up any confusion. When I'm not working and doing hunting, fishing, kayaking, that kind of thing, I'm chasing my two kids around. The second one there is 5 months old. The first one is 2 years old. And since I've had to chase a 2-year-old around, I've gained a new appreciation for 5 months old because they can't outrun me yet. But that's a little bit about me.
Dan, could you sit a little bit closer to the microphone?
So let's try that. How's that work?
I think it's not your headset microphone. I think it's the computer microphone. Either one is fine. Just if you sit a little closer, I think it'll be work just fine.
Okay, I'm getting audio through the headset, but the microphone settings might be wrong. So
this sounds better. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. All right, so a little bit on NRCS and forestry. The goal here for us is to provide technical and financial assistance to private, non-industrial forest landowners. So your average tree farmer, not your Warehousers or Plum Creeks of the world. We have 54 local service centers positioned throughout the state. We'll follow up with this link so that you can find your local service center, as well as some contact information for the local NRCS staff that are assisting us with this call as well. The Environmental Quality Incentives Program is our primary financial assistance program for forest landowners. And we're going to talk about that and kind of the statewide impacts and then how we're administering the Joint Chiefs funding through EQIP in a little bit here. Kind of the first step for accessing most of this funding is to have a forest management plan before other practices like tree planting or thinning or forest stand improvement are considered. EQIP is a program, kind of one of the taglines for NRCS is to help people help the land. And so we provide financial incentives to producers to adopt conservation practices on their property. It's a completely voluntary program, and you can think about it as kind of a problem solution program. In NRCS lingo, this is a resource concern, and we use a conservation practice to address and fix that resource concern. The goal being that we kind of adopt these practices on an operation-wide level and stop problems, hopefully as soon as we find them or on a preventative basis. So it is available in all counties and states. And we spent about $37 million in Wisconsin in fiscal year 2023 through EQIP. If you look at forestry acres treated by the Farm Bill, so all of the funding for EQIP comes from the federal Farm Bill, which is a large bipartisan piece of legislation. So we get one about every 4 years. So if you look at the major practices that we funded through the last 3 Farm Bills, so the 2008 Farm Bill, the 2014 Farm Bill, and the 2018 Farm Bill, there's been a steady increase in acres treated, particularly in woody residue treatment. That's that blue line there. It really jumps up from 2014 to 2018. And a lot of that was actually funded in the last 2 years. And that was part of the result of the derecho in 2019 that blew holes in large parts of northeastern Wisconsin, including the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, and a lot of private land in Langlade, Oconto, and Marinette County, as well as other parts of the state. And so one of the major reasons for doing the Joint Chiefs project that we did in northeastern Wisconsin, centered kind of around that lower Oconto Marinette region of the Chequamegon-Nicolet, was because of this derecho. I have some nice pictures of that coming up, but this graph shows how kind of we've had impacts even before we rolled out the Joint Chiefs funding this last year. with other farm bill, compared to other farm bills, sorry. So for our 2023 EQIP obligations for forestry, this is a selection of forestry practices. You can see what the common ones are here. So forest management plans, brush management would typically be invasive species control. That's things like honeysuckle, buckthorn, both glossy and common, multifloral rose, Japanese barberry, autumn olive, things of those nature. Woody residue treatment is primarily cleanup after storm damage. In some cases, it could also be a result of a harvest or something like that. But I think these obligations in particular were mostly in Oconto, Marinette, and Langlade County, where we had that impact from the derecho. We also do things like stream crossings. One of our partners in Joint Chiefs is Trout Unlimited. And so we're looking at trying to do, especially if we have high quality trout streams in this area, trying to do stream crossings, especially in cases where we have something like a perch culvert. I think I have a couple pictures of things maybe associated with that later on here. So it gives you an idea of kind of where the money is going from EQIP. And this is not, well, it would include a little bit of Joint Chiefs funding, but primarily not including Joint Chiefs funding. This is what our service centers look like. So Northeast Farm and Forest, when we go to breakout sessions, the DC there is Jeff Morashek. Michael Steinbrink is joining us from the Headwaters area. Peggy Winter is coming over from Langlade County. And then I'm pinch hitting for the DC from Shawano, and that covers Shawano and Menominee counties tonight when we go into our breakout sessions. So maybe I'll throw the slide back up when you get there. And that'll kind of be a little bit of a reference. Bill might have something there too as well. So kind of a little bit of a history of Joint Chiefs. So this isn't a new thing, but it's a relatively new thing for Wisconsin. This is the second Joint Chiefs project we've done. So it's a partnership between federal public lands management and federal private lands management assistance. So it's the U.S. Forest Service on the public land side, and it's NRCS on the private land side. And the idea is that we have a large enough project area to make a landscape scale difference, which is why these are typically called landscape restoration partnerships. And so in this case, we're looking at addressing wildfire hazard, water quality, wildlife habitat, climate change impacts, and forest health, which would include things like emerald ash borer mitigation. So projects started in 2014. This is for Joint Chiefs at a nationwide level. They have 3 years of funding. There's been 41 projects total since the beginning of the program. And in 2022, so we were funded in 2023, but in 2022, so the year before we were funded, right, they funded 17 new projects and about $48 million from USDA. And I'm not sure exactly, I never updated the slide with how many they funded along with us in 2023. But here's an idea of where these partnerships are located. You can see there was one previously up by Superior. There's been one in the UP. Now ours is over here. And then all of the rest of them that have been funded on a nationwide level have been either over here in the Appalachians, a couple in the mid-south, I guess, or the south central maybe would be a better way to say that, and then a lot of them closer around the Rocky Mountains. And many of these projects have a wildland fire tie from the Forest Service, and so a lot of work with Joint Chiefs has been done in wildland urban interface and in wildfire prevention. So for us, we're going to look at addressing wildfire threats. So that would be mostly cleaning up the storm damage after the derecho, water quality concerns, which include things like increased sediment issues from impacts from the storm, wildlife habitat, like the trout stream crossings I already mentioned, and then forest health, which would be not only recovering from mechanical plant damage from the windstorm, but also things like preventing invasive species from coming in after logging activities and mitigating emerald ash borer. I'm just going to let this slide sit for about a minute here because I don't want to just read it to you, and that's about all I can do with this slide. So I'm just going to pause here for a minute. So hopefully I'm not cutting anybody off there. We're going to move on to looking at a map here. So these are the units, essentially the county boundaries, where this project has eligibility for private lands management. So you can see here the lighter green. It's a little bit hard to see on this map. You can see where the Chequamegon-Nicolet Forest is there, kind of in the center. And we picked counties that had a watershed tie to that focal area on the Forest Service with that Ocano Forest, Chequamegon-Nicolet boundary. So the kind of partnership icons there are NRCS field offices. So we have one in Rhinelander, in Anago, Shawano, and then Lena that serves Ocano and Marinette County. The dominant habitats we're focusing on here. So northern hardwoods are typical associated forest types there. So aspen, oak, pine, spruce, swamp hardwoods. That would include the black ash that I've been making a big deal over with EAB. Then tag alder wetlands. They're a focal point for golden-winged warbler, as well as breeding habitat for ruffed grouse and American woodcock. So they're very important, probably underappreciated part of the forest landscape, particularly because they just don't grow any timber, but they're really important wildlife habitat component. Riparian habitats, our focal species there is the brook trout. And then for forest openings, obviously, I'm sure you're all familiar with monarch butterflies and how they've been declining. So if we have a chance to maintain forest openings, we're going to do that as well through this program. Kind of our landscape scale objectives, reduction in storm caused fuel loads and fire risk. So that's a big part of this. It really fits in with what Joint Chiefs has done historically. And then if we have that kind of denuding or reduction of vegetation, either from harvesting or from the storm itself, then we have an increased risk of sediment that would go into those storms and into those streams, after storms and negatively affect fish habitat. And so we want greater access and connectivity for aquatic organisms. So a lot of times we put in stream crossings so we can have access and connectivity to habitat we want to be in for hunting or recreation or other purposes. But when you do that, a lot of times we break the connectivity between those stream reaches for the trout. And so we kind of want to have a cake and eat it too there with the right kind of stream crossings in the right places where we're not negatively impacting the organisms. And then so maintaining cool water stream temperatures, that's about either reforesting areas where you might have increased light availability onto those streams, which would warm them up and shift habitat parameters, particularly as a result of EAB that may be spread around as a result of harvests that would be done as a result of the derecho doing cleanup work. And then suitable habitat for golden-winged warblers, that would be more along the lines of those tag alder stands I mentioned, oak wilt prevention, and then just making sure that if we are doing work in these stands, we're getting into appropriate stand stocking and we're doing good silviculture. And then a lot of times we may see after shifts in composition of tree species after large scale disturbance like this, where we get a prevalence of more early successional species like aspen, birch. And ideally we want to shift those communities to things that are more resilient to climate change and less resilient to disease impacts. These are the community benefits we're shooting for. We already talked a little bit about most of these. One key thing that we're adding on this slide is the rural economy. A large part of the northern third of Wisconsin relies on the forest products industry, and everything we're doing here with good silviculture also feeds into that. And then the amount of trails, especially recreational trails for snowmobile and UTVs, were significantly negatively impacted by the derecho because of the amount of trail closures from the amount of downed trees over these trails. And so getting all these areas cleaned up and into a more aesthetically pleasing state is going to be good for tourism as well. So this slide kind of cross-references our main objectives like fuel reduction here on the left with what activities. So these are the NRCS kind of short codes for what these activities are, where they're going to be done, and then what outcomes we're looking for here for these. So this is kind of a lot of the points I've been hitting on here are kind of summarized in this table. This is a slide that will be familiar to a lot of the NRCS folks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Basically, it's looking at kind of how we designate resource concerns. So in this slide here, hopefully all of you can read this. It's a very small print. It's an idea of how much money we're talking about in this fund pool. So this year for 2023, we asked for $165,000 and we got about, I think 138 is what I'm going to show on the next slide and how we allocated that. You can see next year we're asking for 631,000, so significantly more. And then more than that, again, the next year for a total of about $1.5 million. Excuse me, that's been paired with about the same ask from the Forest Service. And so total, this project is going to put about $3 million worth of habitat work on both the public land side of things and the private land side of things into this area of Northeast Wisconsin. And this is kind of our idea of where this might go, and we'll see what actually happens. In order for us to hit these targets, we actually need landowners like you to come in to our field offices and apply for these practices. Excuse me, and then do the work on your own properties. Right. So this is all kind of pie in the sky until we actually start working with you folks. So for 2023 for Joint Chiefs, our major categories, we got $138,000 and change here. And 3 major places we spent that money was forest management plans, forest stand improvement, and tree and shrub establishment or planting. So we wrote 8 plans under this. I guess they haven't been written yet, but they're contracted to be written. 120 acres worth of forest stand improvement and about 65 acres of tree planting from the Joint Chiefs Fund Pool. In total, for all of our funding, so the entire fund pool, not just the major categories, this access control and obstruction removal here, those are associated, those 35.6 acres, they're paired. They're associated with deer barrier fencing. We'll talk about that a little bit more in some of the breakout sessions, particularly in the Shawano one that's going to be with me, because that's been something that's a real concern in northern hardwood stands down there. Then 120 acres is tree planting. 6 structures would be things like bat boxes. Excuse me. And then we also did some, that really small slice. Some of this included tree shrub site prep, which would be maybe spraying or something like along those lines before tree planting. And the main reason we didn't have more of that, I think, is because a lot of that woody residue treatment that I mentioned on the first slide was a significant amount of money, was done in the sign up before Joint Chiefs was available. And so that was probably serving as the majority of the site prep for a lot of these places where we were going back in with, let's say, red pine or something like that. So there's a lot more site prep going on here than is really reflected in this slide. If you guys have any questions for me here on the presentation, hopefully I didn't confuse you too bad. A little bit, said it was going to be about 20 minutes. I'm not too far off of that. So if you guys have any brief questions for me, we can do that before we go to breakout sessions.